Painkiller Ghosts, Chapter 28, A Fall on the Stairs, Part 1 of 2. This is an hour later, now, and this is how it is. Chastity pulls her car into the driveway. She's been listening to a sports broadcast on the radio without even realizing it. She turns off the car and tosses the keys into her blue bag and slams the car door after her. She's hurrying up the sidewalk. She's feeling a little queasy after Suzanne's funeral, and her foot slips on the first brick step heading to the front door, and she slams down hard onto her right side, ribs onto the brick. And for a second, she's out of breath, and then her eyes start to water, and she sneezes there. Lying there on the cold brick, she sneezes and bites her tongue. After a minute, when she's breathing again and breathing slowly, she's holding back her tears, and she gets up, opens the front door, and walks inside. She tries to kick off her shoes, but quickly realizes she needs to lay down on the sofa first. She's feeling lightheaded, dizzy. She puts her head down on the pillow. The television has been left on mute, and she turns up the volume and puts another pillow over her eyes and falls asleep listening to the news. This is at the same time, and this is how it is. Stan goes home and stuffs 5 crushed pills into a blueberry muffin he bought at the local gas station. He eats it as quickly as he can, chasing it with a warm beer. He chomps away and he thinks his front tooth may be loose. He thinks about his pills. He's in a lot of pain. He's going to need more. He thinks he should take a nap. Maybe he'll feel better afterwards. He lies on the sofa, putting his head flat on the cushion, and he covers his eyes with the pillow. With his eyes closed, he feels for the remote control on the floor, finds it, turns on the television, lowering the volume just enough to hear it. He lies with his eyes closed under the pillow, listening to the news, but he cannot fall asleep. Now she's getting up. She steps on the remote control by accident, and that turns off the TV, and one of the batteries falls out. She leaves it next to the remote on the floor. She feels her ribs, not even too hard, and she winces in pain. Her right side is red and a little blue, but not bleeding now. She goes up to the library. She opens the desk drawer. She rolls herself a painkiller. It's an hour or so later. It's now, and she's getting into her car, and she sits there for a few minutes before turning it on. She's afraid she's broken a rib. She takes a deep breath and it hurts. She turns the car on and starts to drive towards the hospital, the same one Time walked to just a couple days ago. She finds a parking spot. She wonders if the insurance card that she has is any good. She got the card from the man she was living with, the one who died up on the roof, or died on the driveway, or maybe died somewhere in between. She walks to the front doors of the hospital. They open automatically, and the cold air is replaced by a warm smell of sanitizers. She finds the front desk, asks where she should go, and she walks down a hallway through some more doors and finds a second desk with 2 nurses. One hands her a clipboard, but not a pen. Chastity finds a seat. It's next to one man, but there's no one to her right. She holds the clipboard in front of her, staring at the questions. She stares at the top of a pen she found in her blue bag. She starts filling out the page. Last name, first name, middle initial, date of birth, and then the man to her left gets up after a name is called and he walks away. And at the same time, another man sits down to her right. She continues. Street number, street name, zip code, daytime phone, evening phone number. Her elbow accidentally nudges the man to her right, the one that just sat there a minute ago, and she continues, emergency contact. And then she stops. She can't think of anyone to write down for an emergency contact. She's just looking at the blank line in front of her, and that's when she gets the feeling that she's being watched. And out of her peripheral vision, towards her right, she sees the man next to her is looking down at her clipboard, at her name, her address, and at the blank line next to her emergency contact. And she recognizes the swollen nose and the blood stain under the left nostril. And Stan smiles at her after looking up from her clipboard. And all of a sudden, she gets lightheaded. Her vision gets dim, and she turns and vomits into his lap, and then she slumps down onto the floor. The nurses behind the desk, now with pins in their hand, hurry across the room, ignoring Stan and pushing him out of the way as he's covered in her vomit. She wakes up, still in her clothes, but covered under a white blanket in a different room. She closes her eyes again and remembers being in the rows of tombstones earlier today, and she falls into a dream of her as a child lost among marble tombstones. There she was, 4 years old, in her favorite corduroy pants with those 3 pennies in her right pocket. She's rubbing them together furiously and lost. She's lost. She was wandering among fake flowers and moss growing up the taller, older tombstones. She could hear her foster father calling her name, but he seemed to be so far away, and little Chastity could not see him, and the cemetery seemed huge, and all those alabaster angels and cracked crosses above her seemed to stare at her, and she could hear her name being called over and over, but now it seemed to be calling from farther and farther away. Suddenly, she realizes there's only 1 penny left in her right pocket. She can't remember taking out the other pennies, and there's no hole. Little Chastity turns around, walking farther from where her foster father is, and she's got her eyes on the ground, looking for her lost pennies. She's clutching the remaining penny, which is warm compared to the cool air on her cheeks. There are tears falling from her lost eyes. She is running, her little legs moving as fast as they can. Then she stops and she sees a piece of paper in the grass. She bends down and picks up with her left hand, the penniless hand, and she turns it over, and she, little Chastity, is looking at the same piece of paper that she drew of herself and of her foster dad in the same cemetery. Only now, the foster father is wearing a bandage over his nose. His left nostril is colored red, is colored outside the line as a panic-stricken child might color, blood red. She hears her foster father's voice calling her, getting farther away. And then little Chastity, she looks up. She sees Stan, bandaged and bleeding, standing next to a tombstone that says Exler. And he's smiling at her and walking towards her, throwing her lost pennies up into the air and catching them, and then throwing them up again and catching them. And when his mouth opens, it sounds like her foster father, far away. But he's here, Stan is. He's here, right in front of her, and getting closer to her. And the last thing she sees is Stan opening his mouth and tossing the 2 copper coins in with wide, crazy eyes, and he's shouting at her. She knows he is shouting, but he sounds like her foster father, getting farther away. Suddenly, Chastity sits up in the hospital. Bright lights and beeping machines, artificial warm air, sanitizer fragrance, worried faces, death nearby folded sheets piled in a corner. She sits up and looks around. Then she swings her legs to the side of the bed and remembers her ribs as she lays on her good side. She sees a nurse notice her and come over towards her, smiling at her.